It's been remarkable to see how quickly philanthropy in North America and in Europe has been able to pivot. And I think there's a very special conjuncture between the special role of Ukrainian civil society and the more flexible among the philanthropists out there. And in a small way, I've been able to see that at work, and I'm very grateful. I've been asked to speak about two things. I've been asked to speak about American sentiment towards the war, and I've been asked to speak about the overall geopolitical position. So, American sentiment is a slightly tricky question. I just came back from the Munich Security Council a week or so ago, and people said, "Well, everyone is despondent or everyone is depressed," and that's not exactly right. What one finds instead is that the melancholy and the depression is a kind of average. The American elite is actually pretty sound on this issue overall, and American public opinion is pretty sound on this issue too. And there is a majority force for passing aid to Ukraine in both houses of the American Congress. At the same time, we have a very organized minority in the House of Representatives, led by the Speaker of the House, who in turn is clearly following the instructions of Donald Trump. And that organized minority has, for the last 4 or 5 months, prevented the United States from passing aid. So we have this weird combination of a public opinion, which is actually not so bad, an elite opinion, which is pretty good, but a systemic problem, which hopefully we'll be able to overcome. But to be clear about this, the systemic problem, the weird voting rules and procedures that we have in the US Parliament are being exploited by a person, Donald Trump, who very clearly wants Ukraine to lose. There ought to be no doubt about that. I mean, whether this is because he wants Biden to have a defeat, whether it's because he just sympathizes with Putin, whether because he thinks he's in a deal with Putin to help Putin, to have Putin help him win the American elections, whatever the motivation is, it's 100% clear that we have this presidential candidate who's exerting untoward and unprecedented influence on our policy at this critical time. So that's the first point. Second point has to do with the stakes of the war. And it's important to me, and here this is a bit in the spirit of what Onjay was saying, it's important to me that when we talk about the stakes of the war, we talk about it in terms of what Ukrainians are already doing for us. Because outside of the little circle that we're in now, in general, this conversation begins by talking about all the things that we think we're doing for the Ukrainians. But the geopolitical stakes and the moral stakes really have to do with the things that Ukrainians are already doing for us and have been doing for us for 2 years or for 10 years, depending upon how you're counting. So for me, there would be 5 or 6 major points here. Number one is order as such. When Russia attacks Ukraine, Russia is attacking the international order of the post-war period. It's trying to change that international order into a matter of power, spectacle, and propaganda. A second major point would be the spirit and the reality of democracy. It's not that common for an autocracy to try to destroy democracy by force. In the last several decades, that has not been normal. I think what we're seeing is a kind of peak in this process in which democracy is in retreat, autocracy is in advance, and we've reached the moment where an autocracy physically attacks a democracy. Though that's a reason why Ukraine has to win. A third geopolitical point is NATO. So if you're in the West, you've been raised with the concern that there would be a war in Europe. The Ukrainians are now absorbing, carrying out the entirety of that war themselves with financial and military assistance from outside, but they're the ones who are doing it. So in other words, the Third World War, which many of us were raised to expect, is actually taking place, but it's taking place only with Ukrainians doing all the fighting, right? All of the fighting. The fourth major point would be China. That in Washington, D.C., at least for the last 15 years or so, the main concern about a major world conflict was China carrying out offensive operations in the Pacific. The fact that Russia has been held back so far in Ukraine, I think, has made that much less likely. Should Russia win, I think concerns about China will quite properly rise again. Next point, a little bit under the surface, but I think very important. In a longer term in the 21st century, whether we get through is going to depend upon the balance of power between the hydrocarbon oligarchs who lie about global warming and generate conflict and those of us who tell the truth about science and seek after alternative sources of fuels. One identity that Vladimir Putin has is as the most important hydrocarbon oligarch. And this war that he's fighting against Ukraine is an example of what happens when a hydrocarbon oligarch gets to do what he pleases. Final point, again, a little bit under the surface, but I think incredibly important. Another doomsday scenario for us as humans in the 21st century is the digital overcoming the human. That in one way or another, by way of the algorithms, by way of AI, by way of our own bad habits and weakness, we lose the basic habits of decency which allow us to have civil society and democracy, urged on in that negative direction by the machines. In this war, the Russians are, of course, trying that, as they did in 2014. But the Ukrainians have shown how human bravery, human communication, and also a certain playful use of the internet can work against all of that. The final point and the underlying point for me is the ethical against the cynical. And I trust this is important for everyone else as well. Russia is fighting this war on the basis of systematic lying, and its allies tend to be people who are also engaged in systematic lying. The parts of the American political spectrum who are in favor of Russia are also engaged in systematic lying, determined lying, on the basis that there is no truth, either empirical or ethical. There just is no truth. That view is entirely inconsistent with democracy. It's entirely inconsistent with human rights. And fundamentally, I think what the Ukrainians are helping us to do is to recognize that there's a world in which people are willing to take risks for things that are true, both true empirically and true ethically. And if we lose this war, if we let the Ukrainians lose, I feel we'll lose a huge part of our souls, to use an old-fashioned word in that sense. That if we let them lose, we will be giving up, or we will be demoralized. We'll find it harder to hold on to the sense that some things are truer than others and some things are better than others. Thank you very much.